music to the noise, yeah, the mess we make. Machine Pun Kelly get caught in the fray. Facts and logic with a twist of chest. Strip it down to truth, yeah, forget the rest. Humor pulls the lights right out of the park. Look beyond the shadows that set the dark. Sparks of laughter fire up the night, bringing clarity when they blur the fight. Cut through the chaos, yeah, the tangled lies. Steam Fun Kelly with a set of clear eyes. Truths and jokes gonna rock this show. Step into light where the real facts glow.
And welcome to another edition of the Pun Show. Today we've got Professor Stuart Craig joining us. He's a professor of, what was it?
Risk and Insurance.
Risk and Insurance at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. He's got his PhD from a little-known economics school called Wharton. But, you know, somebody made it famous. I'm just joking. So anyway, thanks for joining the show, Stu. And I really appreciate you being here. I've been wanting to get like a real economist on the show for a long time because some of these things seem to get more complicated with the current administration and some of the policies they've been passing. That in my very, very amateur opinion, are not helping the economy at all. So I just wanted to start off, I've been diving into this for a couple of months now and learning some things. So I just wanted to get your input on a few terms first, just to kind of get a basis. Because I think while most economists would know these things, not every random Joe on the street would know them. So what is a automatic stabilizer? What does that mean?
Yeah, so when you think about business cycles, right? So sometimes we have good times, sometimes we have bad times. In a recession, there's like a whole bunch of things that the government can do to sort of keep that from becoming more catastrophic, right? And some of those things are more active and more passive. So one of the things they can do is lower the interest rate. That if sort of if there's not enough economic activity, sometimes you lower the interest rate. People save less, they spend more, right? And that sort of gives a boost to the economy. There are sort of more complicated versions of that, sort of monetary policy. There are sort of fiscal policy, right? We can actually pass laws to spend more money, to sort of give people tax credits, and do things that are going to create more economic activity. And automatic stabilizers are policies that are in place where you might not actually have to do anything active, right? So that's going to be stuff like unemployment insurance, right? That's sort of, if we're in a recession and the economic activity is low, we don't need to produce as much, firms are sort of letting people go, right? Unemployment insurance makes sure that consumption doesn't drop too much. There are lots of other reasons that we have these policies, right? We sort of care about the people who lose their jobs and think that we need unemployment insurance to sort of bridge people to the next thing. But the sort of macro implication of that, right, is that there's sort of a buffer to the economy, and that there's sort of you're putting in some floors in terms of kind of how much income people are going to have.
Would Medicaid be an automatic stabilizer?
I don't know if people generally think of Medicaid as an automatic stabilizer, but certainly people do spend money on healthcare, and financial protection against spending lots of money on healthcare is very important. So if we're sort of thinking about the bill that was passed this week, and I should preface all of this by saying, I kind of think about, I'm not a political animal. I tend to think about kind of like the facts and the policy issue, and sort of the maybe this is like, you know, more of an ivory tower version of this. But generally like to think about kind of like in a more agnostic way, just kind of like what's going to happen if you pull one lever or another lever. The sort of political process is both like a little bit heartbreaking for me to watch, and also kind of not my area. But my understanding of the bill that was passed this week is, you know, based on like the Congressional Budget Office report, is that, you know, we're basically expecting the combined effects of everything in there to, you know, lower household income for people sort of at the bottom of the income distribution by 2 to 4%, right, in the next over the next decade or so. And that's, by the way, like not a political, you know, the report was requested by the Democrats, but the Congressional Budget Office is like a nonpartisan office that sits in between, and their job is just to sort of count things up, you know.
They're just doing the math. That's all they're doing.
That's right. Yeah. And trying to do it in sort of the most unbiased way possible.
So with the Medicaid cuts, and you're kind of, do I remember right? Like your kind of specialty is in that medical area somehow?
Yeah, that's right. So I should also preface by saying I'm not like a card-carrying macroeconomist. I know something about this stuff. I sort of started my career wanting to be a labor economist, and then and I do work now that's sort of on competition policy and healthcare markets. But that means that I know, you know, my so that's like very narrowly my expertise. I know quite a bit about economics of health more broadly, and healthcare and health insurance more broadly. And that was kind of the focus that Steve and I both had during PhD. So, and oftentimes a lot of the stuff that we're thinking about is a little bit more on the micro side, and thinking about kind of how people interact with these programs, you know, sort of what it does for them. And, you know, my understanding of kind of how that bill played out in terms of Medicaid is that basically they wanted to implement cuts without implementing cuts, right? And one of the ways that you can do that is by making it more difficult to sign up, right, or to stay signed up. So they instituted a bunch of work requirements and a bunch of paperwork that people have to file every couple of years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but like, you know, I have a PhD in applied economics, and I have a really hard time keeping up with all the paperwork in my life, right? So imagine being, you know, a busy single mom with, you know, juggling parenting and a job, and all of a sudden now you have to, like, you know, submit a bunch of paperwork a couple times a year to the state. So you can imagine that would sort of reduce the number of people who are able to stay on the rolls. And actually, you know, there are kind of estimates that help us sort of calibrate what we think would happen there. So the CBO, I think, let me check my notes. I wrote some notes about the CBO report before this because I thought it might be useful to think about. So the CBO's estimate is that this whole process is going to result in like about 10 million people losing Medicaid coverage.
I think it was 13.7 million by 2036, something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
That's, I mean, my memory might be slightly off, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
So, somebody asked a question. We'll get to that in a second. I have a follow-up to what you were just talking about. One of the things I've been looking at or been reading about is that it could cost like literally hundreds of rural hospitals to shut down because they're already right on the threshold. They're barely surviving right now, and losing those Medicaid payments could be the tipping point. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really hard question to answer. So, I mean, and part of the reason that it's hard is that hospitals are always saying that they're going through terrible hardship all the time, to lobby for more generous reimbursements from the government, or to justify sort of mergers that might be, you know, might sort of improve their bargaining leverage with commercial insurers. So, you know, if you talk to a hospital, representative, like they're always going to tell you that they're about to go out of business. It seems like. That being said, I live in Wisconsin, where we've had 3 rural hospitals close in the last year or two. So it's not, kind of an idle threat for some of these places, and especially rural hospitals, which are going to tend to rely more on Medicare and Medicaid than hospitals in other areas. I think one of the reasons that this is a complicated issue is that most people, when they need something really complicated done, they don't want to go to the rural hospital, even if the rural hospital is quite close to them, right? If you need a really complicated knee replacement, you're probably going to travel, and you're probably going to go to a place that you think of as being very high quality, right?
So if you're like in the middle of Texas and Dallas is 2 hours away, you're not going to go to your local rural hospital. You're going to drive to a good hospital in Dallas.
If you can plan ahead, right, for something like that, then you would probably make that choice, and your doctors would probably tell you that that's what you should do. A lot of these rural hospitals are maybe not even set up to do some of those things.
Right. They're like an average of like 35 beds, right? Like they're just really small.
That's right. Yeah.
They're not,
and more and more
do all that stuff, or the doc. They probably don't even have like a knee specialist there.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And more and more there's a set of services that used to be done in outpatient settings, but now are done used to be done in inpatient settings that we're now able to do in outpatient settings. So there's a lot of cardiac procedures and orthopedic procedures that we can do like one day, sort of same day stenting and stuff for cardiac stuff. And that inherently means that we maybe don't need as many, all in complete hospitals. Now, obviously, on the other side of that, there's a really important access question, right? That people in rural areas still need emergency services, and they still need some, sort of basic minimums of healthcare services. But I think that there are a bunch of trends that are kind of pushing in the direction of, maybe we don't need quite as many, full-on hospitals as we have historically. So it's really hard it's really hard for me to look at a particular hospital closure and say, I know what's going on there. This should or should not have happened, right? And I think it may be sort of the word I'm looking for is efficient. And I should define that more precisely for the non-economist listeners, like efficient for that to be the case. But then we also need to worry about like how many urgent care centers are around to kind of fill the gap, and other kinds of things.
So like, let's say, so if you need a complicated knee surgery, and you can like plan around it, and you can schedule it to go like 100 miles away. But if you're having a heart attack, and there is no hospital within 100 miles, that's an entirely different thing. That's what you're saying.
That's a huge problem, right? Yeah, and time to treatment matters a lot in that situation. So you're probably going to go, wherever's closest. Yeah, and I think that in some situations people kind of know that ahead of time. I have some family and some family friends who live pretty far out, and they're just kind of aware that if a big health problem happens, they might not make it to the hospital in time, and they've made that choice, in retirement to live farther away than they previously did. But there's lots of people who aren't like kind of actively choosing that at that stage of their life, and people who sort of have lived in one place their whole lives, and all of a sudden the hospital disappears, right? That's a really different.
Yeah, and there's also people that just bought a house saying, "Oh, there's a hospital here," knowing that they're safe if they have a heart attack, and then that hospital shutters, and then the next one is 50 miles away, and then that one shutters, and then they're really screwed.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
because
it's true for like all kinds of businesses, right? If you sort of look at like, there's a really famous kind of competition paper from like the mid 80s that sort of documents this, sort of thinking about like how big does a town need to be before they get their first dentist, and then how big does the town need to be before they get their second dentist, third dentist, right? It's like if you were to look at a map and say, here's how far you have to travel to get to like the nearest hospital or the second nearest hospital even, right? That's always going to be farther away in rural areas in the first place, right? So that like sort of margin is more catastrophic because it was already far, and the next closest thing is maybe even farther. But this is sort of a general problem that exists even without kind of hospitals exiting. Like, kind of how do we bring access to good access to healthcare to rural areas when operating hospitals are really big facilities. There's a lot of fixed costs, right, to operating them. You need to do a certain amount of treatment to make it worth it to build the building and to keep it up. And so you really do need a certain number of people to make that viable. And yeah, so how to get that done is sort of a complicated question. I think there's like a lot of solutions to this also that are not about like whether we do or don't have those hospitals open, right? There's a lot of healthcare access stuff that in rural areas especially is really more about like, do we have enough primary care physicians? And Medicaid is a really important part of that, right? People's access to sort of preventative care and being able to kind of get treatment before things get really bad. There's sort of ways besides Medicaid that we can, and ways besides sort of having like many more hospitals that we can think of expanding that access. So you could think of like, one thing that you could do is sort of increase the autonomy and ability of non-physicians to deliver that care, right? So there's constantly battles over whether or not nurse practitioners, which are like people who have master's degrees in nursing, whether nurse practitioners should be allowed to have their own practices, right, that don't operate under the
where they don't have to have like a doctor boss.
Exactly.
What is the other? There's two types that are like not full-fledged MDs, right? There's the nurse practitioners and there's something else. I can't think of
the physician assistants are a similar kind of level. Yeah, and the physician assistants, that political battle over like whether or not they get to do the same things is a little bit different because they're actually trained in the like physician medical model, whereas the nurse practitioners are trained in like a nursing model, and so they're sort of less influenced by kind of the doctors directly in some sense. They like kind of all come together afterwards, work together, but they're sort of trained differently. So the physician assistants are going to be trained like in a medical school, and nurse practitioners are going to be trained in a nursing school.
So I shouldn't be conflating those two things in my head all the time like I do.
They're not exactly the same, but they do have, I think, kind of similar.
They're not doctors, but they can write prescriptions, kind of.
In some situations, right? Yeah, for some things, and exactly, they're not doctors, but they're very like highly skilled medical professionals who can kind of do, I should be careful about this because there's some really specialized like RNs out there too, but I sort of think of them as being kind of like in between those things of like being having a little bit more training and generally working in places where they have a little more autonomy than RNs do, but they're sort of there are kind of rules written oftentimes about kind of where that ends.
So that actually, it's kind of a bit of a segue, but what about when it comes to getting medicine and people like that? If you have 13 million people that all of a sudden can't access medication because it becomes unaffordable because they lost their insurance. So you have people like with high blood pressure that with their medicine, they can maintain the risk. They're a lot less likely to have a heart attack. But now they can't obtain their medicine and they have a heart attack, and then they go to an emergency room, get treated for it. It ends up costing a lot more money not giving them the medication than letting them have access to the medication. And then, if they don't have money for insurance, they don't have money to pay the hospital bill. So that money falls back on the hospital, which goes on to the insurance premiums for people that can pay. Am I saying anything wrong there? Correct me if I am.
So all of that, there's a lot of kind of complicated stuff in there. I think that the spirit of what you're saying is 100% right, which is that people tend to consume more healthcare when they have health insurance, right? And that tends to be a much safer situation for them. So, there's basically, I think, like, when I think about this broad set of issues, there's like 3 research papers that I can think of that like have done a really good job studying this and like getting really good measures of these things.
Like preventive care versus
of kind of like, what does it do to be insured, right?
Okay.
Like what's sort of like the, what does insurance do in terms of like the, kind of healthcare consumption decisions you make and kind of the sort of risk aspect of it. So there's the sort of gold standard for being able to say like, this is the causal effect of like being insured, right? And just to sort of back up for a second, like you could say, here are kind of like healthcare consumption or health outcomes, and here's how they're different by people who have health insurance and who don't, right? And that's a really complicated comparison, in part because people who have health insurance tend to have more money, tend to have jobs that pay for a bunch of their health insurance premiums, right? They're sort of, those people aren't the same in lots of other ways, right?
Okay. So like, for instance, they might not be able to eat as healthy. And so there's other things that have nothing to do with insurance that also affect their health. And so how do you...
That's right. Yeah.
Flesh out the unhealthy eating, which is because unhealthy food is cheaper and so on and so forth.
That's right. Yeah. So they're like unhealthy eating and like, it might not even, so there's like, you could think of it on the behavioral side from the perspective of like when people are getting healthcare, it's sort of a question of like, what is your sort of underlying risk for having like a serious complication, right? Kind of all be summarized into that. And that could be really different across different groups of people with, who, have different, levels of income and also different access to health insurance. So the sort of gold standard for understanding this stuff is like, well, you could flip a coin and say you get health insurance and you don't, right? And if you did that with enough people, you'd be pretty sure that, the across all the people, you sort of had balance of income on either side of that. And like the main difference between those two groups is going to be one has health insurance and one doesn't, right? We often don't do experiments like that because like you wouldn't let me flip a coin and decide whether your kids go to college, right?
Yeah.
It becomes kind of tricky. And so we have to figure out kind of other ways that generate that same kind of situation. But there are actually 2 really big experiments where one was run by the Rand Corporation in the 1970s, and the other was more recent in the early 2000s. Basically, Oregon had like closed its Medicaid rolls, like the number of people who could enroll in Oregon Medicaid for a while. And they had some money that they could use to bring more people into Medicaid, but they had way more people who were like on the wait list than they had money to cover, right? So what they did was they said, okay, we'll actually like randomize among the people on the wait list, we'll actually randomize like who gets it and who doesn't, and we'll see what happens to them. Basically, people are much more likely if you give people health insurance, then they pay less when they go to the doctor and when they go to the hospital, and people are much more likely to go to the doctor and go to the hospital, right? That may be good or bad. Certainly, I think if you talk to or if you sort of take seriously the line that comes out of Republicans in this conversation, right, about like, we want to add copays because we think that's bad, right? We think that there's like too much healthcare consumption that happens when people have health insurance, but there are lots of reasons, like you're saying, that people really need a bunch of healthcare, and if they don't get their insulin or they don't get their sort of regular treatments for high blood pressure or something, right, it could cause really big problems. And I don't think people are like over consuming insulin just for the fun of it, right? So definitely people use more healthcare. They also, one of the parts of this that's not just about sort of health is also like, these are financial products in some sense, right? That they're sort of insuring you against having a big financial loss if you do have to go to the hospital. That's sort of the foundational part of insurance. And there's pretty strong evidence on that too. So if you look at the people in the Oregon experiment, they're much less likely to sort of have kind of like debt or excess debt. And they measure that by like, do you have bills that are like have gone to collection, right? You're much less likely to sort of be in financial distress if you have access to Medicaid versus if you don't.
So even among, because most people that are qualified for Medicaid are not like wealthy.
Right.
So, you know, like it's not just they're like poor people are more likely to have debt. Like you're comparing apples to apples there. It's not.
Exactly, right? This is like, these are two people who qualified for Medicaid and the state just didn't have enough money to cover both of them, right? And so we're like looking at one who, like basically the state flipped a coin and said, you get it and you don't, and then we can compare those two people or
that sounds
groups of people.
How much, if you know of any studies or if you're just, how much has the Affordable Care Act positively or negatively, or maybe both, affected the average man on the street, like the average self-employed guy?
Yeah. So there's still like a substantial number of people who don't buy health insurance. I think at this point, a lot of that is like up to a choice in some sense, or up to your understanding of the program, right? So the reason I say that is that, you know, at least historically, like the subsidies on the premiums are based on your income, and if you make, you know, sort of below certain amounts of money, then your premiums are basically paid for on the exchanges for a lot of folks, and those subsidies sort of phase out as you make more and more money. So the health insurance exchanges offered a lot more insurance to a lot more people, for sure. They also were paired with a big expansion in Medicaid in a lot of places, right? So you may have heard people sort of talk about like, this is an expansion state or not an expansion state.
Yeah.
Or some states that, you know, sort of the federal government recommended and gave kind of matching funds to states to expand their Medicaid programs. And some states did that, and some states didn't. The ones who didn't tended to be more kind of Republican-dominated states where there seemed to be some principle about not doing it. One of the things that's kind of interesting about that is that the states that didn't do that ended up in situations where like more people were on the exchanges and more people were kind of being subsidized on the exchanges. So, you know, it's like a lot of those, I'm sure that there are lots of situations where people kind of fall through the cracks of this. But like a lot of the same people kind of end up getting covered, you know, one way or the other, depending on kind of where they are on one system or the other. In terms of the in terms of kind of the like the way that plays out for people, there's the third paper. So there's like I started to tell you about three papers. There's like the Rand health insurance experiment. There's the Oregon health insurance experiment, and the third paper I'm thinking about is actually done by a group of folks. One of whom is a co-author of mine, who's at the U.S. Treasury, and it's a paper where they look at basically there was a program where they sent mailings to people who had early on in the ACA who had sort of gotten hit by a tax penalty for not enrolling in the exchange plans, and they sent these letters, and they looked at people who like got a letter, didn't get a letter, to kind of see how that affected whether they signed up or not. But they also so definitely if you get a letter, you're much more likely to think about it and go through the process of signing up. But it also turns out that once you have insurance in that, you know, through that process, you're also a lot less likely to die. And that's, I think, kind of a surprising.
Not dying is nice.
Yeah. To me, I think that was a very surprising result, because when I think of like, you know, folks who are kind of like on the margin of like maybe buying health insurance if they get a letter and if they understand that there's a tax penalty, right? that they're more likely to buy health insurance instead of pay the tax penalty. Like I think of that as a person who's probably pretty healthy, right? Because if you're really sick, you probably don't need a letter reminding you to get health insurance. That would have been what I would have thought, right? But it turns out that even this like kind of marginal group where the letter makes a big difference benefits quite a bit from it, which I think is an important number and kind of a surprising number to me.
And the fine was pretty minimal before the Supreme Court struck it down, right? It was like $50 or I can't remember.
Yeah, that's right. It was definitely nowhere near the amount of money that you would pay in premiums, right?
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, one of the things I think this highlights for me, actually, it's related to the bill, yesterday's bill, is that if what it really takes is like a mailer reminding you to like go to healthcare.gov, right? That seems important from the perspective of like things that we do to like increase hassle costs to people who are on Medicaid, right? Like it would seem to me like if you need health insurance, having to like submit some paperwork like showing that you have a job twice a year probably wouldn't, under some models of behavior might not seem like it would keep people off of Medicaid. But given this result, right, that just sending a reminder email to people about the insurance exchanges increases how much they sign up, you can pretty quickly see, I think, how sort of putting in these extra hassles into the Medicaid program could have a really big effect.
Have you? I am under the impression, and I don't know if you are familiar at all, but that work requirements for Medicaid have not had a good history. Is that accurate? Like it ends up pushing off people because they didn't know they were supposed to go to this website, and so they lose their insurance, and then they can never get it back or whatever.
I think there's definitely some of that. So I wrote some notes about this. So and it actually relates to kind of my like previous life as an aspiring labor economist. So I before I was in PhD program with Steve, I did my bachelor's degree in industrial and labor relations, and I actually wrote my senior thesis about unemployment insurance and was doing a whole bunch of research on welfare programs. So there's a big law in the mid 90s, in 1996, that was passed to really reform the welfare system, and it kind of touched everything, right? It touched Medicaid. A big focus of it was like cash assistance to single moms. But
what I think of as the welfare mom bill, which is kind of to like the I don't even want it. There was a lot. It's kind of semi-racist bill, but
oh, for sure, absolutely, yeah. In impact and to some extent, and I mean, I think of it as not to like this isn't my opinion as an expert, just as like a citizen, right? When I think of it in the context of the like rhetoric that like kind of conservative Republican groups were kind of pushing about like sort of the welfare queen, right? The image of like the welfare queen is this like woman who keeps having babies in order to stay on welfare or something, right? There was a real like racial undertone to a lot of that stuff. So that program did a lot of things. And I've been thinking about it a little bit, kind of in the context of the Medicaid debate, because I think one of the things that's like really interesting about these conversations and sort of the way that they come up in policy discussion, right, is like part of the reason that that's happening is because it's like a means tested program, right? Mm-hmm. Like you have to make less than a certain amount of money to get Medicaid or to get kind of these cash assistance programs. And that means that like politically it's easier to dismantle, right? Because you're not making as many people angry, right? It's the reason, one of the reasons it's really difficult to change things about Medicare, right? And Social Security is because everybody gets it, right? So making big changes to those programs or big cuts to those programs is really unpopular. Whereas it's somehow a lot easier politically to sort of dismantle these programs that are like really targeted assistance to poor people, even if that's like very efficient in terms of maximizing the benefit that we get for like a smaller amount of money, right? So
somebody
Yeah.
asked a question here that
Oh, sure.
wanted, he wants to know your opinion of the 80-hour month work volunteer requirement.
Yeah. So, if I think about that, it doesn't seem huge, right? 80 hours a week is like, or 80 hours a month is like 20 hours a week on average, maybe a little less. I guess I don't really know I don't have a professional opinion as an economist about like how poor people should be spending their time. I think that most people are kind of doing the best that they can. And I don't think that most people are like trying not to get a job because they, because they value Medicaid so much,
Yeah.
I think most people want more money than Medicaid and zero income to do lots of things with, and so if they can, they would like to do that. But I think in my mind, I actually don't know the statistics on this. I would love to, so I shouldn't like speak confidently about it, but I would love to know like how many Medicaid recipients are working at least that much in the first place. It's probably a lot, would be my guess, right? So
how many that aren't could, like, there might be
Right.
some people that just simply for physical reasons or I had a it's not exactly the same thing, but I had I used to manage a clothing store, and I had a salesperson that she worked part-time. She was really good. I wanted to promote her, but she said if I promote her, then she would only make this much more money, but she would lose her Medicaid for her 6 children. And, paying for her 6 children for insurance would, make, and then there's also just like, I think like, if you have a bunch of kids, you've got to worry about daycare or whatever, which is ridiculously expensive these days. Like, so you might have 4 kids that are under 7, and what do you do with those kids for those 20 hours a week?
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's like I think that's exactly like the set of things that I think about, right? Is like, what do we as a society expect low income parents to be doing with their time, right? And how many rules do we want to write about that, right? I think that like the person that you were just talking about doesn't sound like they're like lazy. In fact, it sounds like they're working really hard if they have earned a promotion, right? And it's sort of a question about like the way that the program is like structured that sort of makes it hard for them to financially to kind of keep moving up, right? Yeah, and to me that seems like you could loosen the rules that if you're worried about that person working more, you could loosen the rules that say Medicaid goes away when that happens, right? If you wanted to.
Or clear it out.
Exactly. And I think that like, just to sort of back up to like kind of the way that this got implemented this week, like we were saying, like there are probably a lot of people on Medicaid who are working 20 hours a week or something approximately that already, right? And ones who don't, right, may have some important reason why not. And it could be like a family structure reason. It could also be like a disability reason, right? And I know that there are like provisions, right, in the plan that say like, okay, well, like if you can't work because of a disability, that's okay, right? But then, right, under the current rules, like all of that just sort of sorts itself out, and we just understand that most people who want more than $0 and Medicaid are going to do some work. And like now what we're thinking about is like enforcing that and requiring that person to demonstrate that they have that disability, right, in order to make that happen. And it just sort of like adds these layers of things that person needs to do to continue to have health insurance.
So then the next kind of category of thing I want to talk about is if Medicaid, with these Medicaid cuts, if due to those Medicaid cuts, a hospital shuts down in a rural community, what kind of economic fallout is there for that community? Because usually the hospitals are one of the largest, not only one of the largest employers, but also one of the largest consumers in that area. So that, they buy food from the local community to feed people at the hospital, for instance, So what is the economic fallout of those small towns?
That's a really good question that I don't actually know the answer to. I don't think anybody has a great estimate of that. So it can be tough to say precisely, but let me just sort of validate the logic that you're going through, because I think it's correct on some level, right? And I think the idea is related to, you had sort of asked me to think about multipliers a little bit, right?
Yes. Multipliers is definitely something I wanted to talk about, and this is a great way to intro.
Yeah, good segue to that.
Multipliers, and then great.
Right. Yeah. So what economists call a multiplier is this idea that when we spend money, when we have a fiscal policy where we spend money on some sort of government spending, that the value that generates in the economy is not just that number, right? It's that number plus some multiplier, because oftentimes these things kind of have spillover effects, right? And so the idea is, if we're paying Medicare and Medicaid are paying for healthcare services at a hospital in this town, right? It's not just the value of the healthcare that's being delivered, right? It's also that those people are going to go off and trade things with other people in the community, right? And that's going to be additional economic activity that is valuable. And that could be food that they're actually buying things from farmers, but also a lot of these towns are not strictly rural communities. They're they have some kind of areas that are urban enough that you would put a hospital there, and there's some surrounding service industry and kind of lots of things going on. And I think about, my family lives in kind of a rural part of Ohio. And, I think about sort of outside of Cleveland.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it east, west? I got engaged in Ohio, so sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So my parents met at Kent State, and they lived kind of on either side.
Oh,
of
okay.
Kent State.
Yeah, been there. Yeah.
Didn't
get shot.
Yeah. Very fortunately, yeah. They made it. I think about some of the areas that you see, in kind of parts of the country like that, the healthcare system really is the only big economic activity around, people aren't moving to these areas to get new jobs, right? So the people who are living there are people who have been there before. The economy has kind of deteriorated over time, and sort of a lot of the money that's flowing in is coming from is coming through the healthcare system. So it's one of the, I think both political parties, seems to me, have done just not enough to sort of look after working class workers over the last.
I agree.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's really controversial to do things that are big spending measures, big job retraining programs, or big financial transfers that would compensate people for the, structure of change that's happening, right? We used to pay 5 people to work in every Blockbuster. Now there's a much smaller number of people needed to do that function at Netflix. Do we tax Netflix and give it to all the people who lost their jobs at a Blockbuster? Not usually, right?
Right.
So one of the main, I think, one of the main ways that we actually continue to do redistribution is through the healthcare system, right? And that comes in a couple ways. In one case, directly, instead of,
when you say redistribution, Republicans like to use redistribution. like a dirty word, even though you could argue this tax bill is a redistribution of money from poor people to rich people.
That's right. And it depends on like what your baseline is, right?
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, I think a lot of people value, I think even people who I know who are pretty moderate or a little conservative, you know, kind of value living in a country where the poorest people are not extremely poor, right? And that might, you know, like in your example of like they go to, you know, people without health insurance go to the ER, the hospital eats the cost, it has to get kind of like made up in revenue in some other, like cross-subsidized by some other part of the hospital. Like, yeah, that part like costs us some money, but even just from like kind of a preferences and like what our value set is, right? I think most people don't want to live in a country where the poorest people are like, you know, extremely poor. And so, you know, there's always been some amount of redistribution. I think historically, you know, before the kind of like political economy we have now and sort of like reliance on markets, historically, a lot more of that was done by religious institutions, right? And that's become like less and less important over time, or like the sort of role of religious institutions in doing that's become less important over time. And you know, that means that, you know, the government takes up some of that as well. But yeah, I think
this is my extremely amateur view of the economy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I like to analogize it to a water fountain, where the water has to come in through the bottom of the fountain, goes up, it's suctioned up, and then it sprays out of the top of the fountain. So like, if the bottom of the fountain gets clogged up, that means that we're overregulated. The water can't get into the system to have people like invest and stimulate the economy. But at the top of the fountain, if you've got not enough regulations and progressive taxes, then it gets clogged up there and all the water ends up just kind of hoarding at the top. And so you need to balance the regulations and the taxes to keep the water flowing. Is that a ludicrous, or does that make sense?
I think that does make sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of related to these issues of like, you know, the stabilizers and stuff, right? Of like, you know, you don't really want people just fending for themselves when something bad happens, and you want to kind of like insure the whole economy against sort of very bad recessions and bad, you know, kind of worse outcomes. Like, and it's hard to kind of think about that sometimes. Like, I think that the Great Recession, right? The recession from 2007 to 2009, and of course the like, you know, unemployment that was sort of generated by that sort of continued for even longer. But what's technically kind of the economic contraction happened between, you know, December 2007 to like July of 2009 about. Like, I think at one point unemployment was like a little over 10% during that time period, right. And like kind of at the peak, you know, and I think what's hard to think about is like counterfactually, like if we didn't have as much like public policy kind of giving people money, extending unemployment benefits for people, right, doing all of these things, that could have been, you know, all of that could have been much, much worse, right? We didn't see that version of the world, right? But could have been a lot worse than what we ended up with.
And inflation was actually, there was a little bit of deflation, right? Like it was, because inflation was so low, we were able to like drop interest rates down to nothing, which was able to stimulate the economy without causing hyperinflation or something, which I think is kind of the opposite of the situation we're in now, where if we went into a recession, inflation might go up.
Yeah, right. I should be careful how I talk about this, because I get turned around talking about inflation sometimes too. And when I think about inflation, I think the way like there's probably like a little bit of a gap between how like micro and macro economists think about inflation. Because for a macroeconomist, it's like one component of like kind of a model that's at a very high level of abstraction. And as a microeconomist, when I think of inflation, I think about like rising egg prices and what generates rising egg prices,
Right.
and kind of how the basket of goods that people are consuming.
If I can just interject one thing here? By the way, you've mentioned Steve a couple of times. Steve is my brother who was at Wharton with Stuart. So that's that's the Steve he's mentioning too. But one time I was out to dinner with Steve and his family, and I asked him about, like the inflation back in 2022 or 23 or whenever it was, when it was really high. And I asked him if Joe Biden caused inflation, and he just laughed. His eventual answer was, there is no one thing that causes inflation. If you're thinking one thing caused inflation, then you have no understanding of inflation, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
Inflation isn't
the price of eggs to rise, and what causes the price of gas to rise might not be entirely related.
Perfect. Yeah. So inflation is just a word that we use to say that the levels of prices for things are rising, right? And when we generate kind of indexes of inflation, we're sort of taking like an average set of like what lots of people tend to consume and saying, okay, on average, how much is the price of this basket of things going up over time? But certainly not all of the prices for all those things are rising at the same rate. And the causes for why those prices are rising could be really different across those settings, right? So if I think about like real estate or something, right? I mean, there's a lot of there's not even one answer there, right? But I can think of that there was a lot of kind of relocation that happened when people like were in COVID and decided they wanted to live in different places than pre-COVID. There's sort of like supply chain issues that kind of came up as people were like getting a lot more things shipped to them in that moment, right?
Right.
If I think about eggs, right, people think about, there's no like political answer to why egg prices are high, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it would be wrong to hold Joe Biden responsible for that. It would similarly be wrong to hold, Donald Trump to that if he had been the person in charge at the time, right? It's like it's really just a much more basic question of like, how many eggs do we have, right? And how do prices respond when there's less supply in the market? And that supply shock is
in the market because there were less egg-laying hens because they had to kill a bunch of them because of the bird flu and so on.
Exactly, right? So that's not like a policy issue, right? Mm-hmm. I think if you're worried about how that affects people, you could try to invest in things that make substitutes for eggs easier to get, or you could, right, give people more money to be able to afford some set of, some minimum number of eggs or something. But it's actually like not really possible to just increase the number of eggs that are available.
It's basically just supply and demand. That's what is causing it.
Exactly.
It's the most basic principle of economics.
Yeah, that's right. Well, sometimes I think the even simpler thing is I meant to say this actually when we were talking about health insurance, and like, that when you have health insurance, you're partially covered, and that means you consume more healthcare, right? It's like, I would say that 90% of the field of economics, or at least microeconomics, can be summarized as, if you make things cheaper, people are going to do more of it, right? Mm-hmm. If you make things more expensive, they're going to do less of it. And obviously there are like lots of situations that get more complicated than that, but sort of the core at a lot of of what's happening in economics really boils down to that.
So what about there's actually, I'm sorry, there's mass deportations, which I don't know how much you've looked into this, but like, you're in Wisconsin, and I read like 50% of dairy farm workers are undocumented immigrants. And so like the dairy farmer, I literally read an article about dairy farm workers in Wisconsin that are very concerned about mass deportations because they're just, and the title of the article is, "Who's Going to Milk Our Cows?" That, I mean, obviously they run on these systems, but who connects the system to the cow? So if there's mass deportations, then one, you have people that are just deported, and number two, you have people that are afraid to show up for work because they're afraid to be deported. How much does that impact supply? And then how much will that impact demand? Or is that like way off your parameter?
Oh, that's a really good question. that I don't know the answer to. So let me do what economists do really well, is assume that it does impact supply, right? I think that you usually expect expect impacts from things like that to be more short run, right? So, if that ends up happening in that way, and we sort of have lower dairy production, then you would see the same thing that you see with eggs, right? Like all of the amount that we can produce would go down, and all of that stuff would get more expensive. In the long run, there's usually sort of the ability to adjust on other margins, right? So when you think about a firm is taking some like mix of inputs and then like turning them into outputs, and they kind of do this in a way that's sort of the most cost efficient. And what's most cost efficient depends on kind of the technology that they have, and also kind of how much it costs to hire workers versus how much does it cost to like build a machine that automatically milks a cow, right? Over time, right, you have more of an ability to shift away from people inputs and toward technology inputs, right? So it's sort of, I don't think that you're going to see like a mass transition of people kind of running in to fill those roles, right?
Yeah. I don't know too many people that wish they could be cow milkers, and they're
that's
just
right.
like,
So
I'd be milking cows if those illegals weren't stealing my job. I never heard anybody say that.
Right. So either supply is going to go down, right? In order for supply to not go down, you need to hire more workers. Those workers are going to be higher wage workers probably, right? Because they're alternatives, because they're going to be documented, and their alternative labor market options are going to have higher wages typically. And that would also make sort of make everything more expensive, right? Make the final product more expensive. So, kind of all those things move in the same direction. I think over time, either way, you're going to see more of an incentive for firms to kind of move away from doing things the way that they're doing it. And sort of the parallel example that I have in my mind is like with steel tariffs, right? It's not like, if you look at a graph of kind of like employment in steel production, it's not like it's really that responsive to steel tariffs. Like when we've put them in the, sort of last couple decades, like in the... It's
not like you have a bunch of people that want to go work in a steel refinery now that those jobs are open.
Yeah, well, and right. So, I mean, part of it depends on sort of your expectation of like how permanent those tariffs are. But, another big part of it is like we've kind of like gotten a lot more efficient at producing steel with fewer people involved, right? And so even if you were to like really put in a bunch of tariffs on foreign steel, it's not like we're going to regain all of the steel jobs that we had in the 70s. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So it's not really like all these jobs are going to be created. It's just we're going to find ways to work around the tariffs and the mass deportations and whatnot. And so it's not like there's this great reward waiting for Joe Blue Collar that just wants that better paying blue collar job.
Right. I think that that's generally the case. And with the tariffs, like the example that I have on the tariff side that I think illustrates this really well. So even if that were true, right, I think that the scope for that is pretty minimal in a lot of these cases. Mm-hmm. Even if that were true, like that ends up being very expensive for people, right? So there's sort of...
Can you real quick, just, for people that don't really understand how tariffs work, you have a president that's saying other countries pay for them. Can you explain the process by which, how tariffs work and to the end consumer? And I think there's a lot of people that think 100% of the tariff always gets transferred to the consumer, which I don't think is accurate either. So could you just explain the tariff process and how that works?
100%. Yeah. There's a very general kind of issue here about, economists call this pass-through, right? So if you institute a tax on something, not all of that gets loaded into the price usually, right? One of the examples that I think about a lot is it's not a government example. It's just like a lot of people have employer-sponsored health insurance, and technically their employer pays 80% of that premium, right? But it turns out, right, that like what the employer is thinking about when they're hiring a worker isn't like the salary in isolation. They're thinking about kind of the total compensation for the employee. And so if health insurance premiums get more expensive, they're just going to pay the workers less, right? And there are like multiple studies. I have a study on this, like multiple studies showing that happens, right? You can kind of argue about the degree of like what percent of it gets paid by workers versus the employer. But generally, I think we have pretty strong evidence that that's how it works. And so you're right that like it's not all one or the other. But in general, tariffs do two things, right? Tariffs are going to well, what tariffs are going to do is they're going to raise the price of everything that we import, right? Or at least everything we import that we put a tariff on. Okay, so that means that in order to buy at that price,
by raise the price on everything we import, you mean the price for the importer?
That's right. Yeah, it's like you're shifting their supply curve up by the amount of the tax, right?
Okay.
And so you end up at a new equilibrium point that's not exactly, you know, depending on the slopes of the supply and demand curve, it's not going to be exactly the size of the tariff different, right? But it's going to be a different price. And that means that consumers are going to bear some cost of that, and so are the producers. And on the other side, the folks who benefit from it are like a much smaller number of domestic producers, right, who now don't have to compete with other, you know, global producers of that thing unless the price is like higher to the amount of the tariff, basically, right? So it basically says, you know, for whatever the like shift in price is, right, then the domestic producers can kind of, it's worth it for domestic producers to produce even up to like whatever the size of the tariff is more. So
if a domestic producer was selling said table at $100 and the importer was selling it at $95, then it went up $10. The importers went up $10 because of tariffs. The domestic producer could raise theirs up to $104, make more money, and still be undercutting the importer.
That's right. That's right. Now, we generally don't think of like, you know, we think of there as being like a domestic supply curve, right? So that like as the like price that domestic producers can get for something goes up, right, more domestic producers produce, right? And they produce higher quantities, right? So part of what the sort of justification for a tariff is, right, is that you're going to increase the amount of stuff that domestic producers are able to sell and at higher prices, right? And so there's sort of this gain that accrues to the domestic producers. And who loses from that? Like there's two groups of people who lose from that. The first is the not domestic, right? The importing, or the producers in other countries, right? Foreign producers, and also domestic consumers, right? Who are now paying higher prices for both the imported and domestic products, right? Before, the consumer would have paid $90, $95, $96, I think was your number, right? For the imported table. And now, right, maybe they only pay 100, not 106, right? But 100, right? But they're still paying a higher price for that,
right?
To get it from the domestic producer. So the sizes of those things are, I think, this is a thing that I think people underappreciate, right? Is that usually a tariff impacts like the benefits a really small number of domestic producers, but like a lot, right? Like if you save one person's entire job, they have a big benefit from that, but it's one person, right? And on the other side, the consumers that are affected, right? It's a really small impact on consumers, but it's every consumer, right, is affected by this, right? And the size of that tends to be much bigger than the benefit that's gained by the domestic producers. So to give you kind of an illustrating example of that, there was a situation. I mean, it went on for a really long time, like over a decade, where the U.S. was worried that Korea was overly subsidizing Samsung and LG in producing washing machines, right? And they were like outcompeting Maytag, right? And so the U.S. put tariffs on washing machines that we imported from Korea.
That was like 2018, 2019, something like that, right?
I think this stuff started, definitely pre-Trump administration. This stuff started maybe even in like the early Obama administration.
Oh, okay.
And so in response to that, right, LG and Samsung just moved their factories to other places, to China, to other places in Asia, and eventually the U.S. put a tariff on all imported washing machines, right? And LG and Samsung decided to build factories in the United States to produce these things in the United States. But they got a lot of local subsidies from the governments, from the government in the United States to build the factories there. And right, it increased the prices that we're paying for washing machines because all of this had to get sorted out through tariffs. And the estimate that I've seen that's estimated by like economists in a peer-reviewed study, the estimates of this are that for every job saved throughout this whole thing, right, it costs us like $800,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
Right. So like, because consumers are, paying all these higher prices and everything. So like we could have just written a check for $800,000 to each of the people, right? If we could have identified them, that's sort of the scale of like, how much are kind of consumers harmed by this? Even if like each consumer is harmed only a little bit, but it's everybody versus like, how much are like a small group benefiting from tariffs.
So the new jobs aren't always worth the cost of the new jobs.
Almost never. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think about, we have another question. What is your opinion on Trump's kind of arbitrary, I'm going to raise the tariffs to 145% today, and then I'm going to lower it back down to 30% the next day. One thought I have on that is that like the way he plays with the stock market is when the stock market starts diving, people that want to save their 401ks are the ones selling. But then when he goes, oh, now it's only 30%, it's the people that don't need 401ks that are buying. Like there's a wealth transfer going on there too, but that's my opinion. I don't know if there's any validity to that.
I don't either. I think one thing I do want to acknowledge is that like I can take a pretty hard line on kind of like tariffs basically only being distortionary, right? Only creating inefficiency in the sense of like what we just talked about, right?
Well, yeah, Steve basically told me that you're not going to find a credible economist that endorses the idea of tariffs. Like he's.
I think that's true to some extent. I think it's worth acknowledging that there are like other reasons that we impose tariffs besides saving people's jobs, right? Or besides, you may be, it is not wrong, I think, to be somewhat concerned about the politics of like, do we want to be reliant on this other country as our only producer of X, right? There's sort of like national security reasons why we might think that we need to keep some like viable.
Like when we couldn't get any computer chips after COVID. And
exactly,
like,
right?
That was one of the primary causes of inflation.
That's right. Now, it's not obvious that you want to use a tariff to solve that problem, right? Like you might think that the better thing to do is just to subsidize tariff production in the United States rather than taxing imported chips, right? In that situation. But tariffs are kind of a broad policy tool that get used in a lot of ways. I think that from the perspective of the product market you're talking about, it's like you're not going to find anybody that thinks that this is like a net benefit to efficiency from the perspective of neither country. It's not like one country's losing, other countries gaining from tariffs. It's both countries are losing from tariffs. So like in general, it's just not. yeah, not.
What about the whole day-to-day
Not
fluctuating it thing? What does that do to?
Yeah. Okay.
Somebody,
Right.
like if you're going to say, okay, it's going to be 50% on China, then somebody can go, okay, I'm going to build something because there's a chance I can make money off of this now. But if you invest all that money and then halfway through building it, Trump says, okay, it's going to be 10% now, and
That's
so
right.
you sunk all that money into something that is now not viable.
So yeah, so I mean, this goes back, I think, to like some of what we were talking about with like the dairy farmers, right? Which is like some of these things could be very painful in the short run, right? So if we have shortages of certain products in the short run, right, because we're taxing them, or shortage might not be the right word, right? But we have really high prices because we imposed this tariff, and you know, sort of it costs more to import it. We're not as good at producing it, otherwise we would have outcompeted the importers in the first place, right? More costly to produce it here. Over time, you might expect us to get better at producing it here, right, if those tariffs stay in place. But that's not going to happen if people don't think the tariffs are permanent, right? You're not going to invest in like the new technology or the new thing to bring the domestic prices down if you think that tomorrow you're going to have to compete with a much more efficient producer again.
So I have one more question. I know we're over an hour, and I promised you an hour, but I have one more question if you have time.
All right. Yeah, sure.
And this one is not even one it's one that came up in our conversation. Is like you had mentioned that there's a tendency to find ways to automate roles to replace jobs. I'm a writer.
Yeah.
And a writer who has had my job replaced by AI. So there are like, how is AI going to impact the economy in terms of employment? Is there anything? Are there any studies on this, or has anybody looked into this? Because I feel like, and you know, like I get job offers that are because I have some experience in writing to go and train AIs, which is like a horrible, like it's like the tedium of a line worker in a factory. Like it's just horrible work. And it's the opposite of what anybody that, you know, wanted to be creative is doing. So and they also pay half as much. What is your thought on all that? Like, is AI going to end up being a job killer and a kind of robot? Like the people that work on AI are just stuck in menial, tedious jobs, or?
I hope not. I'm sort of optimistic about it. Like, I think that, you know, when we talk about, let's like go back to like so this kind of thing always happens, right? Like when we invented a printing press, or like, you know, all of these like situations where we automate things, right? And generally those things are actually good for the economy, both because they sort of do it cheaply and efficiently, but also because it frees people up to do more things that they weren't doing before, right? So that's like a very like vague general statement that I think a lot of economists would make, and I hope not too many people roll their eyes when they hear it. But I think it is generally kind of the arc of progress. I think there are kind of multiple problems with this as I see it. Like a big part of it is kind of like how like people are affected by that differently, right? We have to, like in the Blockbuster Netflix example, we have to worry about the Blockbuster employee, right? But it is also true that like at the time that Netflix put Blockbuster out of business, it was basically just mailing people DVDs and like running a sort of basic streaming service. And now, right, they have their own studio company. They're producing a lot of their own content, right? There are potentially more jobs that came out of that than Netflix destroyed in the first place, right? Now, there's sort of a distributional question of like who gets those jobs, and you know, and this is also kind of an abstraction from kind of the core question about like AI. I think we don't know a lot about what AI or how AI works and how well we can use it for certain things yet. But I will sort of say, like, kind of this is less of my opinion as an economist and more as my opinion as like a casual user of AI and like a tech literate person. There's nothing intelligent about AI. It is literally predicting what it thinks you want to read, right? So it's taking in a bunch of data and like a prompt, saying, okay, I'm going to predict what I think I've been trained to show you based on that prompt, right? And so it doesn't really have the capacity to reason or to be creative, right? It can kind of like come up with combinations of things that sort of fit its prediction algorithm, right? But it isn't thinking. I think that there are some jobs that maybe this will reveal how little thinking was going into them in the first place. I think that writing is not high on my list of that kind of job, right? Maybe some kinds of writing, like maybe writing copy for like products and stuff, right? For like advertising and things like that. But I think of like, truly creative pursuits, right? There's like, I deeply want to believe that I think people are capable of distinguishing what makes that human versus not, right? And that people actually do want to consume art that's made by another person, because that's sort of the point, is you're sharing the human experience, not with a person and not a machine. I sort of suspect that there are going to be kind of limits to what AI can take over, and maybe we get to spend more time doing some of those things, right? I do think that there's something that's a little backwards about it. Like, I wish that AI would take over like all the chores in my house rather than like try to badly
Wouldn't that
take.
be awesome? Like if we had like one of those Roombas on steroids where it like washed your dishes and made your bed and did your laundry, like what's her name? And from the Jetsons, the robot mason. That's what we need.
Yeah, exactly, right. Not take not. And I think that so I sort of think about this a lot in the context of my students. I teach MBA students here at the business school. And I can very easily tell who's using AI and who isn't, because like the answers are just more interesting when a person writes them, right? There's like logic and argumentation, and like right or wrong, right? There's I can kind of like see a thought process, and I think a lot of the more complicated stuff like AI just isn't capable of doing. So there's also
people try to pass off AI as their homework to you.
So I think one place where I sometimes I can run into a question about whether or not I think that's happening, depending on like, I think there are some students for whom like English is not their first language, who might write the whole thing and then use AI to like clean up some language, right? Versus like people, which is different than students kind of relying on it intensely to kind of basically do the whole thing. I have noticed, differences in student performance, when I sort of let them have unlimited time and don't monitor how they take an exam versus, versus like have them do it in a classroom, or like have them do it in a way that's monitored, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like I like to think AI is great for research, but it's not great. Like, it's great for a research assistant, but you don't just want to regurgitate exactly what the AI says.
So like, I can get AI to do some pretty cool things. Yeah, I can get AI to do some pretty cool things, but knowing how to get it to do that sort of required me to be an expert on it in the first place, right? On that particular issue in the first place. So I think that's one of the things that I try to ingrain in students is like, you may have access to this tool for the rest of your life, but like knowing how to prompt it well, and knowing like whether or not what it's giving you back is like makes any sense at all, sort of requires that you have an idea of like an intuition for like what the answer should include or involve, right? And not even like AI, but just like if you're sort of going to rely on in general on something that's not you and your brain power and your ability to logic and kind of know things, then you're sort of stuck taking whoever's word for it, whether that's an AI, whether that's like sort of a business associate that you're negotiating with, right?
Mhm.
Like, if you don't kind of like understand how, in my case, I'm teaching them economics. So if you don't understand how the economy works and you're just sort of like trusting what people say to you about it, right, without sort of having a toolkit for understanding whether that makes any sense, then like you're going to get taken advantage of,
Yeah, right. So I got one more really quick question for you that has nothing to do with economics.
Okay.
I'm looking back over your right shoulder there, and I see 4 electric guitars hanging. So I'm assuming you know how to play guitar and are a bit of a fan. Who is your favorite guitar player?
Oh my gosh, that is a deeply difficult question.
Hardest one I've asked you, huh?
Yeah. There's a lot of people that I think of. I think that some people that like I go back to a lot in my own playing and sort of think about a lot are John Frusciante, who's the guitar player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Dimebag Darrell, who was the guitar player for Pantera. Since you're in Texas, I imagine that resonates at least a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So, but lots of other things. I was kind of raised on like blues and jazz and stuff. That's sort of how I learned how to play. But a lot of the stuff I listen to privately is a lot more like alternative rock and metal and stuff.
So yeah, you've got an eclectic taste.
Yeah.
I like to sometimes I'll even just I'll go on YouTube Music while I'm working, and I'll just type in some kind of just listen to some kind of music I've never listened to before to find out if I like it or not. Try to expand my horizons and whatnot. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for joining me. You answered a lot of questions I have, and maybe there's some things I'm definitely going to have to contemplate and reflect on afterwards. But really appreciate you joining, and so thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you for everyone who tuned in with questions. This is really fun.